Good morning to Coffee with Captain of the Pride of Baltimore, Jan Miles. This Saturday morning, in the middle of October, one of our coolest mornings so far this fall. Clear, cold fronts pass through, uh, and celebrating the fact that we didn't actually have to do the race.
Yeah.
The Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race, which could not be sailed, but has been virtually participated in. Jeff, maybe you could describe Jeff Crosby, chief mate, Pride of Baltimore 2, behind the camera.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So this year, due to the pandemic, there was a virtual Great Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race fundraiser. So the whole premise is the boat that raises the most funds in a period of time over several days will win the schooner race. And each boat has set a goal that they're trying to reach. Our goal is $2,000, and we're just over $500 away from reaching that goal. So if you want to help us reach our goal, hit that donate button, and we'd very much appreciate that. Captain Miles, you have your own personal boat that you've been getting out and about on recently. What kind of boat do you have?
So it acts like a schooner, but is not.
Sure.
So it's a cat catch, and cat catches, whether they're catboat schooners, as some exist today, or ketches, they do exhibit the same basic similarities to the balance that is represented by a two-masted schooner, whereby that after sail is positioned on an after mast that is so close to the center of the length of the vessel that it acts as a big air rudder, which is what happens with schooners with their big mainsail, doing a similar kind of position where the mast is sort of near the middle. The aftermost mast is near the middle of the length of the vessel. And so this cat catch, if you don't respect that mizzen, you're not going to be able to turn away.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And in cat schooners would be even more dramatic that way. But she's a 32-footer designed by Chuck Payne from up in Maine back in the late 70s, built by a company called Able Marine. No longer exists, but had a very good reputation in its day. Fiberglass with some wood trim, carbon fiber mandrel made
Ooh.
unstayed masts.
Fancy.
So as my good friend Captain Dan Moreland said when he learned that I'd gotten it, he said, "Trust Jan to buy a boat with no strings."
Yeah, yeah.
No yelling, no screaming. Yeah, so my wife and I have been enjoying the fact that all the work is up front. You know, once you get those sails up, there's nothing else to do but steer the boat.
Yeah, no, that's pretty delightful. Yeah.
So it's a classic vanilla kind of shape. It's trunk cabin, aft cockpit, and very easy sailboat. Goes to windward. But it's interesting. I think the new thing that came to me was how much you worry about the leeches or think in terms of the leeches rather than the luff.
Oh, sure.
So it's sort of windsurfing with two masts in a sense that you're drafting based on the leeches and not so much on the luff. And she goes to windward. She doesn't have quite the pull sharp to windward, but give her 10 degrees and then she powers right up on those leeches and she sails right along. And I love to sit back like this and look up the mast. Those buggy whips, it's just like an antenna.
Yeah.
If you've ever watched an antenna with you bouncing around, it's just it's fun to watch.
Sure.
It's not frightening at all. It's just fun to watch.
Yeah, kind of a different
Yeah, it goes
dynamic.
forward,
Yeah.
it goes sideways, it goes everywhere. And it's fully battened at the top third of the sail. So the result is that the head of the sail, when it luffs a little bit, is not doing a big scallop. It is pretty interesting, but it's mostly just plain envelope, simple cruising.
And no strings.
And no strings, and it's easy to day sail, so that's mostly what we've done. We haven't yet done much bay adventuring, so.
Sure. Well, there's plenty of time for that.
Yeah.
So we're participating in this thing called the Great Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race. which I believe you were a part of starting the Great Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race. Can you tell that story?
I didn't so much start it as I was the target.
Ah, sure.
Or rather, Pride of Baltimore 2 was the target, but I was going to be the skipper, so I became the target. So Lane Briggs, a tremendous star of the Chesapeake Bay, from Virginia, but he was as mythically popular up here as he was down there, was at the launching of the Pride of Baltimore 2. This is April 30, 1988. And in his gravelly voice, and if there's a gravelly voice to call a gravelly voice, his voice was gravelly. Come on. We're walking away from the launch. The launch is a success, and the crowd's dispersing, and he's maybe 20 feet away from me. We're just going about our way from the epicenter, and he's like, carry on. Doesn't even look at me. I challenge you, the Pride of Baltimore to race with my boat. Case of beer. Baltimore to Norfolk. And sure, Lane. So,
well, real quickly, what was his boat?
Okay, so yeah, oh, that's right. Yeah, you have to know his boat. So, it's a cross between and this is very loosely imaginative.
Sure.
It's a cross between a Pacific Northwest, sort of the type that you might see relative to fishing or towing a net. Not a fishing boat per se, but the way it's closed in and has the structure, and then a gaff catch. Now, they call it a tuggantine. It had quite a bit of power, and it was designed for doing quite a bit of utility work.
Sure.
And it had this catch rig, a sizable one, on it. And the genesis of this particular vessel was a previous vessel that had been converted in the sense that it had been given a rig as an auxiliary sail research project for understanding the power of wind when used to reduce consumption of fuel under commercial services. And the second vessel is this Norfolk Rebel. Look her up. She's really quite a thoughtful piece, stimulating bit of work.
Sure.
And so he's going to race his tuggantine, which is maybe a third the length of Pride of Baltimore, and when you consider all the head rig of Pride of Baltimore too.
Right.
And they're very. I mean, he carries a spinnaker. I mean, they've got all the accoutrements, but it's like a beetle against a tiger cat, you know.
Yeah,
it's
just
so
no grouping them together.
Yeah, right. And but the power of Lane, the popularity of Lane, eventually created the race. And they did the first race while Pride was in Europe, so we didn't actually live up to the case of beer challenge.
Sure.
Throwdown. But we did come back for race number 3. We were back in time for race number 3. And in that race, there was Spirit of Massachusetts was probably our closest comparable vessel at that time. And at that time, skippered by a friend of mine, colleague friend of mine who sailed together, J.B. Smith. And there was this wonderful semi-moonlit, pretty dark but slightly moonlit evening. It was a wind pattern of being southwest, south-southwest. So we're beating down the early part of the bay, northern part of the bay, that afternoon into the evening, with a bit of a shift from southeast actually to southwest. And we got caught on the wrong side of that shift, in the sense that we were all the way to the east on a starboard tack when it finally arrived. The wind shift arrived. And it was only to the southwest. west southwest, something like that. So we had to quick come around and go right across the bay to get to the west. And we managed to cross just ahead of the Spirit of Massachusetts. In the dark, you see the port and starboard light, and we get across. And she was enough to the west that we didn't cross her very far before we flipped around. Mm-hmm. Now, with Pride of Baltimore 2, loose-footed foresail, loose-footed staysail, loose-footed jib, loose-footed jib top, along with a square topsail and the main runners, is you flip over and you're on this starboard tack. You got the yards aground because the topsail comes around first. You're going to windward, but you're going really slow.
Sure.
Because you got the jib top to pass first, and then the outermost jib, and then the jib comes across, and with enough breeze that you can't do it all at the same time. There's just not enough people.
Yep.
So so the foresail is sheeted in on the windward side now, all aback, but it's twisted. So it's not a blade that's aback. It's a big curve. So you're actually doing pretty well. So through the lee goes the Spirit of Massachusetts. And through the wind shadow as well, and carries on. So, and she's hard on the wind for her. So we finally get everything across. I mean, the crew were doing a great job. It just takes that long, right?
Yeah.
And I think we had the Tegallon on her at the time. It wasn't that much wind that we couldn't have the Tegallon on her. And then 10 degrees and a knot faster. We shoot down the axis of the bay, straight on down towards Smith Point. And I remember seeing J.B. Smith later at the shore. He just shook his head, sort of chewing his lip. It just like, wow.
Yeah.
So, that was quite a nighttime image. And then we were just too busy. We were getting on down the rest of the race. So.
Yeah.
So Pride was able to get, I think we had also in that race, I think wind went calm towards the end.
Sure.
But we had gotten across the finish line first. So we more or less did the euphemism of a horizon job on the rest of the fleet, including the Spirit of Massachusetts, and and then had the additional misfortune to the others, that the wind died out, so it just got longer. So not only did we take line honors, which gets a clock, and that clock that's in the aft cabin there is the first clock that represents the big boats or any boat for that matter, crossing Thimble, the latitude line of Thimble Light at the entrance to Norfolk, Hampton Roads, and then a whole bunch of other recognitions like first in class and some kind of, there's a bunch of awards. That's one thing that the schooner race does is it tries to recognize everybody's effort. Because this is about Save the Bay. See, the theme is fundraising, having fun with boats, enjoying the like-mindedness of love for schooners, but also love and respect of the Chesapeake Bay estuary. And so any excess funds is fundraising for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation or Heritage.
Yeah.
And so the organizing of the race itself is a nonprofit, which is what's going on right now. And is every time we participate or that race is held, which is annually in October, and then also extra proceeds going out to Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And I think in the last several years there's actually been some recognition of other good applicable works, like helping out with kid programs and things like that.
Sure. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can you kind of just describe the length of the race? Where does it start? Where does it finish? Where do all the boats start before they even get to the starting line?
Yeah, so logistically, I mean, the label is Baltimore to Norfolk.
Sure.
But logistically, you can't do that. It's not practical. You've got the Patapsco River. You've got the northern part of the bay, north of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, with lots of shoals and lots of stuff. So the start is off of the mouth of the Severn River, which essentially is off of Annapolis. And it's a straight shot down. There are several different finishes based on class situations. So there's I think there's a finish at Cove Point and there might be which is near the Calvert Cliffs, which is just near the Patuxent River, and then there might be another. I think a Windmill Point is another register that has an award related to it, and so that's about 127 miles. As the race goes. Now the transit for everybody, because you have a big party in Baltimore to kick the whole thing off, and I say party, it's actually a poor description. There's a lot of celebration going on. We get kids involved with visiting vessels. There's a parade of sail the night before the actual race for the Patapsco River, Baltimore, and it's highlighting the value of the vessel, the value of the bay, through show and tell. And then there's like 30 odd miles, is it? Down to the actual start from maybe it's 20 miles. But anyhow, it's a distance between where the boats are here in Baltimore to the start off of Annapolis. And then there's another like 15 miles between the finish and the docks in Norfolk Harbor, which could sometimes be over on the Portsmouth, Virginia side or the Norfolk side. So over the years, it's shifted a bit. And so it's a gross travel for the vessels of roughly 150 miles.
Sure. Yeah.
Overall, maybe a little bit more. I think it's 150. So for 30-foot boats, 40-foot boats, it's no small endeavor.
Yeah.
For depending upon the wind, it's no small endeavor for a big boat. So had we been racing this time, it was blowing 15 to 20, 25 out of the south.
Just straight up the bay.
Straight up out of the bay. So it would have been a threat. And we've seen this before, but because we've seen it before, when I did that little modeling on the Time Zero navigation software where I could do the ship's polars with the grid weather, it just was a demonstration of, it would have been one arduous experience. And,
sure.
So anyway, I was happy to just only have to imagine it.
Yeah, this year, that's pretty great being on land. What was the slowest Chesapeake Bay schooner race that you can remember?
Oh, I think somewhat early in the 90s, not the first race, but somewhere in the 90s. I don't think we crossed the finish line until Saturday morning.
Oh, wow.
In the dark, but Saturday morning.
Yeah.
Most of the time we're finishing before dark Friday night.
Yeah.
And there have been a number of times we finished before dawn Friday morning. So,
and the race always starts on a Thursday, right?
Correct. So it starts early Thursday afternoon. The official finish time is like 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. And then there's a big gathering in the afternoon to celebrate the finish race, and all the award ceremony is going.
Yeah, awards and oysters and
yeah. So a lot of tales.
Yes, yeah, very much so. Yeah,
sea stories.
Yeah.
So the thing that the race has done over the decades now has become exceedingly competitive. There was 94, I think it was. No, 98. Excuse me, 98. It attracted the schooner Brilliant among some other vessels. Very, very competitive. It's when one of the really fastest races occurred. Shortest time length. That was later broken here in the teens, I guess it was, when Virginia led us. We both broke that at the same time. We broke it, but we were like 10 minutes behind Virginia, and we broke that fastest record. And so Virginia continues to carry that. So that's just the sort of the parade.
Yeah.
Where the competitiveness is coming in is Woodwind down in Annapolis is a very nimble vessel and very well sailed. And so again, half our size, maybe a little less depending upon how you're using the numbers. and she's almost tied with Pride in terms of, or rather, Pride's almost tied with her in terms of those line honors. I think they have 6 or 7. We have 4 or 5, and we're neck and neck physically, boat for boat. We're neck and neck for a lot of the bay almost all the time. In the lighter windward work, she's going to get to ahead of us, and then when it picks up, we can start to close the group. Or when it's, of course, beam reaching, then of course our waterline length takes on, and so that competition as a local competition is really kind of fun. The Virginia, she's faster than Pride under certain circumstances, but other times we've been able to carry our way ahead of her. So there's a tradition, there's a friendly tradition of jousting with each other.
Sure. What are some other boats that have come in and kind of given Pride a really good competition down the bay?
Well, the first laminated reproduction America came, and we had an interesting transition of wind pattern when both boats were pretty close to each other. Now she's 100-odd feet long, so she's very close to Pride's hull size. She doesn't carry the head rig, but so in dead light air, we're talking 6 knots to 7, 8 knots of true wind. Pride is more weatherly for about the same boat speed. So we're talking 10 to 15 degrees of difference.
Wow.
Now, her underwater body shape is really cut up. It has nothing to do with tradition. She's basically a canoe with a short length, not real short, but somewhat short length keel on her, and then a separation, and then a rudder. And in very light conditions, it's known that hull form or anything like that, that's true for the really extreme high-end racing boats. The same thing happens in really, really, really light air. They just can't get to windward. They need that boat speed to keep from drifting sideways, having their...
Right.
So with Pride's larger plane for her size, she can hold it even in really light air. Now, you go to 12 to 15 true, that America is a rocket ship. And she stopped. Not only is she rocket ship, she gets to be more weatherly. So, and then, so that was an interesting contrast of traditional look, but modern execution, versus pretty much both execution and look is traditional with Pride of Baltimore.
Yeah.
So we have the displacement. I mean, the America doesn't have anywhere near the displacement Pride has. We're almost double hers.
Sure.
And then later on, America 2 came by. She's short enough that it's sort of doesn't quite equate.
Right.
But she's still more weatherly, quicker, just because of that canoe, that efficiency factor that's driven by the lighter weight construction and that form that allows them to be mostly above the water. Woodwind's that way in a similar sort of way. It's basically a canoe with a somewhat, it's not a fin keel, but it is a keel that still is, and it has a semi-attached rudder, so they have a lot of a reduced wetted surface for their size, and so the combination of the staysail rig, schooner rig, and the general proportions, it's no surprise that a shorter, smaller boat is going to be equal to Pride in almost all the average conditions. We're talking from light air up through, say, 15 knots true, and then depending upon angle, it can start to shift around, and then above 12 to 15 knots true, then Pride can be start to get past her.
Yeah, so, water line weight, all that comes into play. Tom Price has asked a question. How fast relatively is summer wind? So Patrick posted a photo, a really cool photo of us fending off summer wind.
Yeah.
I happened to be on board for that race. It was a really great race. First off, can you describe what summer wind is and kind of her history?
So she's quite early in the century behind us, Alden schooner.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see in that picture is that a very modern schooner rig. So she's a kind of a carbon fiber mast arrangement with a no gaff. It used to be a gaff rig boat, no gaff, and highly radiused leach with full battens.
Mm-hmm.
So and she's very yacht. She's not working boat. See, Pride and Lady Maryland and Sultana, they're the working side of the things,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get the Woodwind and Summerwind, the one we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They're the yacht side of the evolution of engineering and hull form and strength of material technology advancements. So in that picture, what we were doing was being chased because it's a downwind. We were driving our way downwind, so the wind was northerly, northwesterly, and meant that you couldn't really just aim down the bay. So you had to work your way downwind for best boat speeds. Now you could commit to go wing and wing for those boats that make that easy or have
Mm-hmm.
that advantage. The masts are somewhat vertical. If there's enough force, if you have rake, you have to have some force to make it work, or it's a boom foresail. We don't have a boom foresail, so it's pretty hard for us to do. To do. But anyhow, what's happening is she's got all this radial and batten and modern rig, and she's giving chase, and she's coming around our windward side. And I found it fascinating to experience how far we could go up carrying the stunsail. Because we're doing our reaching thing. We got the gallant, got the stunsail, and she went up because she's being forced up. We didn't flutter the stunsail. We didn't worry. We didn't have reason to be concerned about the force on the stunsail boom. But when summer wind went around, she then fell on her ear.
Oh, okay.
Relatively speaking, she really came over, and then she had trouble managing that. So we jousted like that 2 or 3 times, and then we all ran out of room to the west, so we had to wear ship, and we were able to sail deeper than she, which is sort of an interesting truth. It's interesting that was so.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that in hands that knew the boat really, really well, that she should be beating Pride most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think she's a bit tricky. I think she's got that sail power, displacement, balance situation such, and then the technology, the gear, means that she really powers up beam reaching, but if she starts to go, if she is reaching and she starts to get ahead, she has to reconfigure her sail plan a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe she's a little tender with all this, I'm not certain, but anyhow, we've raced with her 3 times,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 4, I think 3 times. And boat for boat, she's beat us once, we beat her once, and then we were more or less tied in one race. It was a transition year for her. She was being donated to the Naval Academy,
Mm-hmm.
and the owner that donated her, his professional captain, was on board for that transition. And it was a beat to windward. Not as serious as this one virtually was.
Right.
But we wound up more or less finishing across the finish line almost the same time. We weren't leading the fleet. There was others that were ahead of us. But there's that contrast. You got that 1920s or 30s hull form, near 90 odd feet long with the classic hull form, but a narrower beam to length ratio than Pride's is, while being a displacement boat, and a windward work. We're taking our square topsail, we're taking all that loose footed stuff, we're going to windward. She's got this fully battened main and fore with the radius tops with no gas, and 2 headsails, a staysail and I think they're both loose footed. I'm not certain. She's boom staysail.
Mm-hmm.
And and going on. And so that was sort of generationally speaking and engineeringly speaking, there allow the technology. There's a huge contrast there, but both boats more or less equal going to windward. And conceivably, that transition with Naval Academy people on board who didn't know the boat very well, with a sort of a transition captain being sort of like sort of a pilot situation where you're advising the actual captain. There's probably some inefficiencies there, and it was blowing just fresh enough that both boats were challenged anyway,
right,
for pleasing the amount of forces, amount of angle of heel, all these kinds of things. So those 3 races we've worked together, and so it's surprising that they've been as close as they have been. But I think if any vessel like that, particularly that vessel with a really experienced group with them, there's reason to believe that it would always be beating Pride, except maybe in a power broad reach.
Sure.
That's where maybe our
weight
while our beam gets in the way, the ability to carry and keep at the highest reaches of the hull speed in the bay where there's not a lot of sea, maybe we'd be able to beat her that way, but it'd be pretty close.
Sure. What are some other cool boats that have come down to join the race?
Oh boy, I don't know.
There's so many.
Well, we've gone through some phases. I mean, there was a while there when the Chesapeake Bay had a few guest visitors that are not local, and then there are other years when we've had a lot, and then we seem to have years where we're not so many. But I guess the Tullamore might be one of the exotic ones, and she had that race in 98, where it was really fast for everybody, and I wasn't part of it because Pride was in the Pacific with Dan Parrott coming down the coast, so I was intrigued by what was happening, so I actually drove my car down to near Herring Bay and took a look at the fleet going by.
Sure.
And they were spread out as they were reaching downwind. They were driving around. But Steve Briggs was asked to come aboard Tullamore and be a bit of a water guide, waterman guide. And with his counsel, and the wind was a bit east of north, expected to continue to back around to the east eventually. He said, let's go down the eastern side. Because quite often you go to the western side if you're not staying in the middle, and you can get a little bit of extra pressure. Well, because the wind was a little bit more to the easterly quadrant, northeast quadrant, he was guiding the vessel to the east side of the bay. She did very, very, very well. And I don't remember the details, but I don't think she was far from the first finish, or I think she might have been 4th or 5th boat across the line. And there were other slippery boats that were, she's keeping up with Brilliant. Brilliant was going down there, and that's no slouch, much like the Summer Wind classic hull form. Just shorter, but she's well sailed. George Moffat was skipper of her, and he knew her details like crazy. He knew how to sail her really, really quickly. So we've had the Gazella of Philadelphia in the race.
Oh yeah, she's cool.
The Mystic Whaler has been a regular up until recently. And Mystic Whaler was mythically part of the fabric at Chesapeake Bay the Great Schooner Race. And John Edgington, owner, master, would come in the fall from his summer programs. It works in the southern New England area. But he's been unable, that market is not as good for him as it had been in the previous years, and so he hasn't been coming down. And she suffers, she's great off the wind and reaching. She suffers going upwind. She's basically a chunky boat with a centerboard though, so she can get into the shallow waters if she wants to.
Right, might have a bit of advantage there if you're a creative thinker. So we've talked about some cool boats, talked about the slowest race that Pride has had. What's the fastest race that Pride has had down the bay?
Well, I guess it would be following the Virginia. Hooray for Virginia!
Right.
Yeah, so that would be our fastest, was following Virginia. We were maybe 10, 11 minutes behind her. And she got off ahead of us very early. We were a bit tardy at the start. I think that's how that worked out. And it was a broad reach start. One of the things with Pride is there's not a lot of maneuvering room to the north of the start area.
Yeah.
With wind conditions, certain wind conditions. So if it's blowing really blustery between the Chesapeake Bay and the start, for a vessel the size and complexity of Pride, there's not a lot of maneuvering room. So trying to figure out how to pile on sail, when to pile on sail, and still keep the flexibility, because Pride's so loose-footed. You've got the foresail, the staysail, and the jib and the square topsail. Sometimes you don't want the square topsail on until after, because it's northwest. You're not going to carry the square topsail in 20-25 to windward unless it's not to windward. So you're maneuvering around. It's just tough to maneuver around. And so I think that Virginia did a better job of getting a start. And then because it was so fresh a breeze, we weren't going to capture her, because she's 2 feet narrower than we are. I think we're 26 and she's 24, something like that. Maybe it's 4 feet. She might be 22.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's significant. You got the hull form in the water, but you don't have that wider melon seed cleaving the water. And so for very similar waterline lengths, there's a little bit of difference, but it's not more than, say, 5 feet. So it's hers might be shorter. And then she has high enough freeboard that all she does is lean over. She doesn't dip the edge, whereas Pride's dipping her channels and getting to the deck edge wet. So I think Virginia could go to 30 without getting the deck wet. Now, it's not a comfortable place to be, and it's not advised for the long term. But it means that as these things come and go, the puffs come and go, she just has no real additional resistance. She just charges ahead. So Pride increases her resistance in any of those things beyond, say, 20 degrees. And so she just continued. But we were able to hold on. We wound up setting the stunsail a couple of different times in that race, because the angle was just far enough and strong enough. We couldn't always sail, but then it got a little bit more alongside, and we could. They talked about, at the race, they talked about, oh, they got their stunsail back up again. Oh, no.
Gain that little bit of extra speed. Yeah.
So that would be the fastest we've ever done. I think one of the earlier races with Woodwind that I enjoy, because again it was a little bit of that moonlight quality, is we're in the lower bay and there's dim enough that you couldn't see clearly, but you got enough light that you could sort of see them with the lights and the distance and what have you. And we went with, again, northeasterly a bit, so we had the stunsail on her and we were broad reaching port tack down the lower bay, and she was to the east of us when Woodwind was, and just ever so slowly we etched our way ahead and took line honors, I don't know, 5 minutes ahead of, maybe less. So you're getting down to the last 2, 3, 4 miles and you're wondering how this is all going to work out. So that shows how well she was doing in terms of her size compared to Pride.
Yeah.
It was just lumbering along. You couldn't do anything else. We had the stunsail, had the gansail, had everything trimmed just right, and the angle was right. We weren't cheating on the angle, like sailing too deep and getting shadowing. We were full and by, broad to the bend, but the quality of the night, light in the wee hours of the Friday morning, and having that satisfaction of the result. I mean, it wasn't strategy; it was just power.
Right.
It was, and steer well.
Yeah.
And it was got another clock.
Yeah. As you mentioned before, because of the Chesapeake Bay being a protected waterway, it kind of creates some unique conditions for sailing. And correct me if I'm wrong, is during a Chesapeake Bay schooner race that Pride has gone as fast as she's ever gone.
No, not that I'm aware of. You see, it's tough to tell. And it might be an unfair comparison because I think it could be true in reality, but we have no way of making that determination clearly. Well, I wasn't on board for a report that they saw the Speedo. What was the number? Do you remember that report?
It was 14 and a half.
Okay, so we actually saw the number 15 on 3 different occasions within a period of, say, a minute. We were in the Atlantic. It was 96 going east. And I think it was Tim Fresh.
Oh, sure.
So he gives a call in the late evening. He's on the helm. I'm down below at the chart table by happenstance because I think I'm assessing knowledge that the wind was going to increase, and I'm wondering about reducing sail. We were full 4 lowers. I don't think we had the jib top on her. We had this full square top, so no main top, no stunsail, no topgallant. And the sea has been, we've been following this south to southwest to, and it was blowing 30 knots, 25, 30 knots, 10 to 12 foot sea, and it's getting on dark, and I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute, what's going on? So I happen to be at the chart table wondering about this when Tim says, I just saw 15 on the dial. So I look at 2 different GPS outputs, and one happens to be not dampened, and the other one is dampened for 60 seconds.
Yeah.
So I saw 15 on the undampened one pretty quickly thereafter. And then I watched and stayed watching, and I saw 15 on the dampened one. So the knot meter is influenced by a lot of that laminar flow separation that goes on with a hull at any time. And then we saw the GPSs. And so I figure we actually touched for a short period of time, a surge, with an increase of wind. There might have been a yaw, in which case sailing deep meant that we were sailing less deep, and so she powers up because the wind angle is a little bit better, and she gets a wave. So we weren't surfing, it's just that the combination of the winds created this acceleration, surging ahead. So here in the Bay, you don't get those conditions.
Right.
At the best of times, it's just current. So it's conceivable that 14 and a half is an honest 14 and a half. But again, how long did it sustain? Was it?
It was quite a long time.
Yeah. So it's reasonable to think that at that situation, and that was the knot meter or is the GPS? Was that, you see that?
Both.
Both. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be in line with as fast as the boat could go, except in that case the sea is flat and it's power of the wind and the combination's just right, and you're not fighting it. You're not having to steer to keep it. You're just plain hanging on. It's like powered
and
up
go
and
woo.
Yeah. So, but because she doesn't surf and there's no wave to surge with, that would be the more consistent, probably the fastest she's ever gone. Now, when we've done ocean passage making, we've had numerous days of 200 and I can't remember what the number is for some reason. I used to remember it quite clearly. I think it's 249. It might be 59 in a 24-hour period.
Yeah.
We've hit it 4 or 5 times and never gone faster than that.
Right, like that's the
It doesn't matter what the conditions are. Right. When we've done that, different conditions, we've never done more.
Right.
The other longer speed thing is a 1,200 is a period of time. I think we did 5 days. We did not quite 1,200 miles or something like that. That's a bit fuzzy. I'd have to do the numbers. And then the other one that was of meaning, we were in the Gulf of Mexico, moving from, I think it was Mobile to Tampa. And it might have been New Orleans, but I think it was Mobile. And we had 15 hours at I think, an average of 14 and a half or something like that. So that was very close. And that was interesting is that we were pressed up enough that we had a harmonic in the hull.
Oh, cool.
So,
yeah.
but never heard that again.
Eerie.
Never, but it came back again and again and again and again through that 15-hour period of time.
Yeah.
And I was really regretted Florida was in front of us.
That's
I wanted to keep
yeah, right. This is really
24,
great.
the 24-hour number.
Yeah.
But that harmonic, I haven't heard that since. So I don't know what that means. We might have been going more consistently pressured up in the Gulf. In an open water condition, similar to the situation that was in the Bay, but why there was no harmonic, I haven't figured that one out.
Yeah, that's a bit odd.
Yeah.
I got another question in here. Have you ever done the schooner race on a different schooner?
I was a guest. Call me passenger or supercargo at the invitation of Eric Losey aboard the Virginia. In 2018, when we were laid up for economic reasons, and it was so. But my role playing was more as a guest. I wasn't on board to be more than that, and I was very respectful of that. But Eric and I would talk about ideas, and he'd ask me a question, and I'd make an observation. They also had at the time they had some other folks making sales for them, so there was a bit of discussion about that whole conversation, and I was invited in to make comment about that. But yeah, I have not done the race on any other, but when it's been racing, being serious about it. If I'm going to race, be serious about it.
Yeah.
No, not another boat.
What's been your most memorable Chesapeake Bay schooner race, or memorable moments?
Well, I've described a couple of them already. But I think, of course, the photographs can tell something that you're not aware of at the time necessarily. And there are 3 or 4 different photographs of different scenarios that can be sort of a confirming of how well you've presented the vessel in her greatest strengths ways. The most recent one was those shots that occurred from the Kent Island side this spring when we were out sailing around.
Yeah.
The captures the vessel just right. The sail trim is just right, and that shows how your involvement with the crew captured that. It made that happen so that the capture could be occurred. But there was a start of the schooner race on a couple of starts. There's a shot of her broad reaching in a really strong breeze, and there's a couple of those. There's one recently put on in this fundraiser.
Yeah.
That features both Pride and the Virginia, and that's
which I think was the 2017 schooner race.
Right.
Yeah.
And eventually Virginia passed us on that one.
Yeah.
It went through our lee because I was covering that. The reason why we have that angle, that particular moment, is I was forcing the Virginia to go through our lee, and then the cycling of the puffs, she burst through our lee, and continued to lead us down the bay through the rest of the race. There's a shot from that Dawn series of shots is pretty cool.
Yeah, that came out to be really visually
it was a
stunning.
Decent bride, yeah. So now in terms of moments, it's I would say that one of the other ones is the beat to windward. I was quite surprised to realize when I did this virtual thing and compared it to actually doing it in another race, we didn't tack that much. Now there has been another beat to windward where we were tacking every 20 minutes. So the whole crew were on deck for it, but I said, take naps in between and I'll call you.
Yeah.
And until we get enough elbow room where we can get more.
Kind of longer legs.
Yeah, or till the wind shifts enough. The longer legs because of the wind shift or something like that. It's a thing to do. It can be real. The race is a thing. And it's one of the biggest fleets of schooners in the world, I believe. Schooners.
Right.
I don't think they can put together that many out in San Francisco. I don't think that happens that way. They're a pretty concentrated schooner group, but I don't think it's that many as has occurs for Chesapeake Bay. So that's an interesting phenomenon that has occurred. And what a lovely bay to be able to do it in, because you just don't get really, and we don't get the funneling effect. The San Francisco Bay can be violent because of that funneling effect. And you go out of no wind in a shadow of a hill, and you get this Venturi effect, and you're really hanging on tight, and it disappears a mile later. So the Chesapeake Bay, you don't, except for puffs, you don't see that kind of channeling that often. So it's a relatively flat sea for our size. Now, some boats, there was John Beebe Center did a race going to windward, blowing 25 or 30 out of the south. And down by the Potomac River, it was bleeping and gulping by the description. And that was a real wrestle. Because the sea got big.
Right.
The sea was like 6-8 feet.
Yeah, that's pretty
uncomfortable. Wind against current, and the boat was bouncing around. So I haven't had that honor, thankfully.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you on board when Virginia had a gear failure?
Yes, we were within half a boat length of each other.
Yeah,
so I heard the noise. I heard the noise. So we'd gotten a good start. Virginia was going wing and wing later on after the start, which was hard for us to do. So she was surging in the puffs. Her beam was helping with that, and ours was coming later. So eventually she got in our lee quarter, because at some point we stopped having that dead downwind thing, and it was more like a bit of a quarter-reef, so we weren't playing that game anymore. And a puff came in. Now this is after dark, and there was, again, we had the good fortune of having a fairly decent moon at that point. And so 3 times before it happened, the failure happened, 3 times there was this yo-yoing effect. And so we would get the puff just a little bit before Virginia, because she was behind us to leeward. No, the other way around. She'd get it first. She couldn't come around us because I would not let her, so she had to go through our lee. And then she'd fall into our shadow, we'd pick up the puff, and we'd go on. And the range of this yo-yo effect was happening. Each successive time was getting less and more advanced for her. And I was wondering if in the end she'd eventually get through our shadow.
Right.
Now what she was carrying was her main gaff topsail. Proportionally speaking, that's a very big sail.
Mm-hmm.
Now her vertical mass means her shroud spread is very narrow, as is in fishing schooner style of the late 1800s, early 1900s. So her boom could go nearly 90 degrees. So the gaff was having its jaw area come right up against the shroud. And that was what was being the trim agent for the gaff topsail. It wasn't the leech. See, with us, we can't get the boom out that far. So we wind up, even though our gaff will come in contact with the lower shroud at the jaw area, we also get some relief of holding the main gaff topsail because we can't get the boom out that far, because with the rake and the spread of the shrouds, there's leech holding the peak of the gaff before the main gaff topsail comes up. And that wasn't happening with the Virginia. And I didn't predict anything. It's just that the bad fortune was the spar wasn't strong enough to handle that kind of leverage in that puff scenario. So there was this crack. And then, because we were less than a half a boat length apart, you could listen to the conversation.
Yeah.
What was that? And, I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was up high.
Yeah.
And so they made the decision to take everything in. I might have waited a while.
Right. Just kind of see
fall down.
See how it goes. Yeah.
It didn't fall down. But it was a reasonable decision to make. It was just, you know, we're not really in a passenger carrying scenario for Pride. We're in that 6-pack thing. So maybe she's more in a passenger carrying vein. So vein. So, so what happened was they had to reduce so much sale. So had that not happened, I don't know how long it would have been before she got through us, if at all, because at some point, pretty much sure she would have, but I can't remember what the wind pattern was in the lower bay. If it stayed dead north of us, behind us, she'd have carried on, because she's really powerful.
I think it did. Yeah.
So when she goes, read a book, is one of the phrases come on.
Yeah.
There's nothing we can do with that.
Yeah.
We have to reach. A woodwind is a similar situation with some of the boats that she competes with more directly. Is that staysail schooner means there's a lot of shadowing of the sails forward of the mast, and so in our case we get our jibe angle. If we think in terms of 100 degrees going to windward for Pride, I'm guessing it's 80 degrees downwind. Mm-hmm. Modern boats just don't do that. Modern boats, they're like half that. So maybe a third less, maybe 2/3 of that, but still, for woodwind, for her rig, and for us, because of that loose-footed nature of the thing, is that, and a lot of overlap. The headsels all overlap, so they shadow. It's that our deepest angles in the area of 130 true, rather than say 170 to true.
Yeah.
So
which is a pretty big difference.
Yeah. So our jibe angle is almost equal our tack angle going to windward. So.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, that story reminds me of, you know, something you said earlier, that friendly competition. You know, I just remember, you know, we heard that noise, you know, and all of us were looking up, you know, was that us? Was that Virginia? Because we were so close. You know, it's noise aloft. That's not great. You know, and just kind of that whole like, oh man, like, what a bummer, you know. Yeah. There's that real sense of competition, and you try and you push for it, you know. But at the end of the day, you know, everybody's friends and everybody, you know, it's just a really kind of cool competition.
Well, I mean, all of our enthusiasm with schooners in this venue, which is the more traditional, the more classic, the workboat side of it, which is about education and life learning, with the more private schooners being, it's fun, it's a love for the bay, it's a love for the style of boats, it's raising their own kids or having their own friendship. So the combination is like-mindedness. Mm-hmm. And so there's no real there's no money in it. If anything, there's a whole lot of cost in it. But there's this root affection for the reality that is the Chesapeake Bay estuary, and it's been something to celebrate. It got a wonderful history. It's generated a style of sailing that knocked the world in a stormy kind of way, just blew up all the imagination all over the place. 100 years before, we get some of our fastest workboats coming out of New England and Nova Scotia and Canada because of the fishing side of it. And that's all the change in terms of strength of construction and engineering. 100 years before that came this imagination as to hull form, taking it to the degree that they did. Now, you put a lot of rig on anything, you can make it go fast. So I'm not so sure about that rake. Again, like I shared before, there's so many myths about that rake. Because, you know, it helps with bracing. Well, I'm sorry, the pieces come together so close that it's not really true. Maybe on paper, but in actual truth, it just doesn't play a role.
Yeah.
And the Mir is an example of how to prove that. Is they've taken the shrouds and gone into the spar below the doubling, whereas traditionally you go up over the cross trees and come around the mast. And so they did that, so they had the freedom of movement for the lee side yards to come around, because the other limiting factor is the forestay.
Yep.
And in the case of the Shenandoah, they dealt with that by doing a ship top thing, as I understand it. They took the trestles and made them longer going forward.
Yeah.
And they create this sort of extension of bridge to take the forestay further forward so that the yard can come
around further
forward. And so in a big seaway, I wonder what that would be like with pumping.
Yeah.
That leverage, you'd have to build up for that.
Yeah.
In fact, Pride has an updated set of trestles in terms of vertical dimension. We found that we were having so much compression with the top mast coming down onto its fid with the sails we can carry, is that we actually cracked one.
That's unsettling.
That would be 94.
Yeah.
92. And so that following winter, Peter Bedreau and the gang came back and they created a trestle that was half again deeper vertically. It didn't make it longer, just deeper vertically. And so we've never had that compression problem. So extrapolating, imagine the Shenandoah with big in a seaway doing this, with that extra length. What would that mean? Well, you can build around it. If you know it's going to happen, you can build around it. But those are the techniques that relate to dismissing this notion that rake helps with sharp bracing. Yeah. If it does, it's so small that that's not the real factor. Yeah. And so the rake miss. I think it's about holding sail area in the boat. Yep. Because the aspect ratio of the mast being so high is that it starts with holding just plain the mast in the boat in a smaller boat with no rigging. And that's my story is that, you're working with what you got. And we're talking the mid-1600s, late 1600s. You got a forest you can go to and get anything you want. Over in Europe, that wasn't possible. So there's a whole learning process about what's at hand. Mm-hmm. And you can make your cloth, but you're not going to grow rope really fast. So you have limited availability of putting anything up. I mean, today we think of rigging like snap. We get it. And there was a time in the old days when that was true because of the volume of growing for rope. But there'd be this period of time where, and there are examples of boats with vertical masts with no shrouds. Yeah. But they're not big. New Haven Sharpies are like that. And they're just like our laser, just whatever. So, but when you're carrying weight and you got limit, you could have this protection, superstitious protection. Let's pitch it just a little aft without rigging. Right. But then you have rigging. Right. But you've observed your hull form is really getting somewhere. Yeah. But you forget about the hull form and you credit it to the rake. And as you add rigging, you're just preventing this mass from going forward. You can keep piling on sail. Because even when you're going somewhat upwind, you're going to get forward thrust up high before the drag of the hull is going to catch up. And so... So I think that's what goes on with this spread of shrouds based on rake, and in the case of Pride, geez, so much rake. Yeah. We had no trouble keeping the mast of the boat.
Thank goodness.
At least from the wind out. I mean, we had that problem years ago with the connection between the bobstays and the bowsprit, but that's all engineered up. It's just a matter of getting it assessed properly, and there's no risk of that happening again. But then who goes around with that type of boat with three headsails up at the same time and that much wind?
Yeah, who does that?
Yeah, who does that? It was a squall. I didn't intend to do that.
Yeah. Well, Captain Miles, these have been really great stories, and I just want to thank everybody who's donated. We still have a bit to go before we reach our fundraising goal for the virtual Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race. There are links in the comments if you want to help us reach that goal. And Captain Miles, do you have any parting words for us?
So let's not forget the Chesapeake Bay is our asset to enjoy, and therefore our responsibility to take care of it. So support your bay. Even if you're a guest to the Bay Area, please support. It's a most unique estuary. The Great Chesapeake Bay Schooner Race has for 3 decades been part of the advocacy of that asset that we have. So please help us with that. And then, of course, in the world we live in today, stay diligent, everyone.